contracted by Paria to do this job. Well, she said that she's called for stricter standards in Trinidad and Tobago concerning what's reported as working environments and conditions and systems. She's also said that a lot has to be done to bring the industry to where it should be. Ms. Alfonso is August. Good to see you, Nairi. Thanks for agreeing to come on and talk about this. So you say you call for the ILO wanted stricter standards in Trinidad and Tobago concerning what is reported as the working environments and the conditions and systems. Are we to conclude then that that's not the case this far, that the standards are substandard?
Well, good morning, Andy. Thank you for inviting me this morning. When you speak about stricter standards, you're starting from the premise that they are standards. So, what emerged from the commission is in terms of the diving industries, there are no enforced standards.
Yeah, and you see, so the question is whether there's a violation of some sort, that the environment is what it is, or it has been what it has been up until this point. Do we expect at this point that there's going to be a substantial review of these arrangements?
I mean, I think to be fair, let's start off with, you need to have a standard in order to say that somebody breached a standard. So in Trinidad and Tobago, I've said we have a mature oil and gas sector, which is supported by divers, vessels, various type of employees. But in terms of the diving industry, there are no regulations which an employer, whether LMCS or whether Paria or anybody else, is required to follow.
Right. So, and I come to that point later on where I asked, well, if you say that LMCS, that's the contracting firm for which these gentlemen worked, they had broken no regulatory provisions. That was because there was none there to be broken. And to what extent?
And that's the point that I'm trying to make. Is that you can't say somebody has broken some regulatory or some standard that is nationally enforced or legislated in any way, unless there's something that they can in fact break. So you can talk about, best practices, you can talk about international standards, you can say that what was, put in place on that day and for that job, not just for that day, is not compliant with international standards or best practices.
So at this point, is it correct to conclude then that if there's one thing that will come out of this incident, is that there has to be proposition and construction of standards that have to be implemented?
Yes, and I mean the tragedy. I mean there are many tragedies in this matter, but one of the tragedies in this area is that we have an old standard. It's voluntary, out of step with international practice. We have a newer, revised standard, more in step with international best practices. There was a lot of input for a long time by stakeholders. The umbrella organization is the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards. And whatever standards, and the very detailed standard, which was in fact tabled at the Commission of Inquiry, has in fact been drafted. Is it mandatory? No. Is it legislative? No. Is it the law? No.
So should it be all those things?
Oh, yes. I said it had those standards, even the revised standards done many years ago now, being in place, then this job that was undertaken would not have been undertaken with persons who are with scuba qualifications and scuba equipment. If there were commercial divers there who were using scuba equipment.
Yeah, and whose job it is, you think, to do that? And where is, because I wanted to come to that later on, where is the Occupational Safety and Health Agency in any of that?
Well, the position is, you can't, okay, so we have the OSH authority. You can't ask the OSH authority to police, for want of a better term, a non-existent standard. So let's start with, if you're going to draft a policy has to be legislated into effect. And therefore, the breach of it would be a breach of that legislation.
Yeah.
I mean, if you don't have insurance for your car, that's a breach of a law, is it not?
Yes.
Right? And you could be prosecuted if you don't abide by that piece of legislation.
Yeah, I'm coming to making the assumption that there has to be some decision about compensation for the lives that were lost here. I don't know why I put the two together, but one of the questions I have there is to what extent the absence of enforceable standards or any standards at all regarding these operations, how does that affect what is likely to come about in people's calls for compensation for the lives lost here?
Well, I mean, as a normal human being, I'm hopeful that coming out of the slew of evidence that has emerged from the Commission of Inquiry, that the families will find a clear path to compensation. I'm happy, as I'm not representing any families. I'm not any of the attorneys representing the families, but there's a clear path for them to receive compensation. And I say that because an employer has a duty to provide a safe work environment. And if he does not, and there's an injury or there's a death, then our normal law will apply. And compensation is payable. So somebody will be found in want of providing a safe work environment and maintaining that safe work environment, and an outcome, as we all know nationally, has happened, and therefore compensation will flow, regardless of the lack of regulatory framework. That having been said, if you take the long view, having the regulatory framework would have avoided the accident. Having the correct equipment being imposed as a matter of regulatory, and having regulatory force would have meant that this job would not have been affected in the manner that it was.
Yes. And I'm asking a question about where was the Occupational Health and Safety Agency in any of this? They from what you're saying and where the discussion is now, they didn't have any role in seeking to enforce anything because there was nothing to be enforced.
Well, I mean, as I said, OSH is a policing organization. So therefore, OSH I can say there was another accident during the course of the same job. OSH was on site and did investigations and issued stop orders and so on. Any accident, if you have an accident on a building site, somebody falls off of scaffolding for argument's sake, the OSH authority can come and shut you down and do an investigation and say, look, you can't resume, whatever your operations are until these corrective actions are taken, and they can prosecute, of course, the contractor. Now, OSH was on scene at, shall we say, the day of the incident. OSH has produced a report, I believe, and OSH, in fact, is the authority that would have hired the expert.
Yes.
Mr. Khan, right? Zaid Khan, I believe his name is, from Incotech. So that OSH did have a role to play, but unfortunately, it was post-accident, post-loss.
Yes. All right. And coming back to the incident itself and the implications from it, which of the companies, if at all, that can be figured out, which of these two companies carries the greater burden of addressing the issue and making amends where amends has to be made?
I don't think I would want to venture a position of which one has greater liability. I'm not the judge hearing this matter. I am not any of the attorneys who are attempting to prosecute their clients' claims. I would say, prior to reading any documentation in this matter, prior to the thousands of pages that came to my attention in this matter, I had formed a particular conclusion. And following the end of the inquiry, or the end of the evidential part of the inquiry, I actually have not found anything to change my original conclusion, which was there was a lacuna in the work plan of the employer. It couldn't be picked up by PARIA because in their evidence they say they didn't have the expertise to criticize, analyze, second guess LMCS's work plan. And so I would say the cause of the gentleman, the unfortunate gentleman being sucked into, those 5 divers being sucked into the pipeline was a flaw in the work plan. The cause of them not being with their loved ones today, in my view, is that a rescue was not permitted. Not a what shall I say? Not a rescue that was, just pulled out of the air, but a well-planned, well-orchestrated rescue was possible. There's all the evidence that has been led has pointed to that.
Yeah,
if you want to put it bluntly, one person, one entity was responsible for the circumstances that led to the accident, but another entity was responsible for not allowing a rescue of persons who survived that accident.
Well, right, because you say there, and I had it down later down, but I think we could bring it up now. You say that also that on the one hand, Paria happily distanced themselves from LMCS's work plan because of the nature of the contract that they had between the two of them. But then, however, Paria refused to let LMCS operate its own plan to rescue the men and possibly save their lives.
That's no secret. That was quite clear on the evidence. There was some attempt to deny it, but it does appear that Paria is the owner of the installation. Paria is the owner of the surrounding, or is in charge of the surrounding area, and they simply did not permit certain people to do certain things on their property. I mean, there's some denial that, the Coast Guard was the enforcement of that edict not to rescue. But whatever it is, I don't think there's any evidence that will support that persons who came voluntarily, who were trained commercial divers with all the best equipment, were not allowed to dive, were not allowed to go and attempt to rescue their brothers.
And what might be the implication on Paria about that, do you think?
Well, I'm sure that will affect the liability position. I'm sure the lawyers who are prosecuting these claims will focus their attentions on both of the entities. And there will be, if it reaches court, there will be some judge or some master of the court will have to determine, where that, how to apportion that liability. But certainly there's liability on both entities.
What is an expansion of the point you make that Paria handled the incident itself badly and the events and activities that were taking place in the wake of the incident, in the immediate couple of days afterwards?
One of the things that impressed, I don't want to say impressed, but one of the things that struck me was Paria's frontal admittance that they did not have the expertise either to plan the job, they didn't have diving expertise, so they couldn't plan the job, they couldn't critique the job, they couldn't, second guess the job, provide for risks that the contractor had not provided for. Yet when there is an incident, a command team is put in place, the bulk of it sits in an air-conditioned building somewhere remotely, and made decisions based on information and expertise that they didn't have. I mean, that's unarguable. There's that shouts from the evidence.
Yeah.
So even when expertise was called in, one of the things that struck me, amongst a million things that struck me, is that you call in a dry rescue, a person, entity that has expertise in dry rescues in confined spaces. What part of the pipeline was dry?
Yeah.
They did tell the confined rescue experts that they were coming into a water environment, and therefore, that entity could say, look, move on to somebody else. We don't have that expertise. No, they didn't. Those persons arrived on the scene and said, oh, it's a pipeline with water. Oh, we can't do that.
Yeah. And you make the point that this is we're dealing with here, what are we dealing with here in our environment, in our territory, is a mature oil province with thousands of workers. I want to ask you to expand on that. What's the implications of that?
Okay. So diving is used in many aspects of the oil and gas sector, not, around pipelines, to clean the bottom of vessels, to do repairs under vessels, to do underwater inspections, whether on pipelines, installations, a number of things. So it seems to me tragic, to use the kindest word, that we would not have a regulatory framework when many countries, who also have a robust oil and gas sector or ship repair sector, have that regulatory framework. What would account? What's the lack of willpower for us? Because I've said we have an old standard; it's not mandatory. We have a newer standard that is more compliant with international best practice, and we don't do anything to implement. Nothing at all. I mean, I don't see how that could be rationalized, so that though in the drafting process, as we picked up from the inquiry from the Trinidad and Tobago Bureau of Standards, there was a lot of input, there was a lot of international, consultation. There were disagreements among the stakeholders as to what the standards should be, but at some point in time, the government organization that was placed in charge of this exercise has to take it a step further. But coming out of the exercise, there was a standard, but as I said, it remained in the books.
Yeah, I want to ask about when the wife of one of those men who lost their lives, one of the headlines in the paper at the height of the inquiry was that she had made this declaration that I want justice. What does that look like? What should it look like in this case?
Well, I mean, justice is a very subjective term, and I'm sure justice for the families, justice for the families will never be complete because there's nothing we can do to bring back their loved ones. No father, no son, no uncle, nothing can be brought back from anything that the lawyers can do, whether in the commission of inquiry or outside of it. So that level of justice will never be meted out. For me, as an attorney, I would very much like to see that coming out of this, that we have a push to have that regulatory framework implemented and policed properly. That's a legislative intercession. So for me, that would be prime. Certainly, high up on the list next to that would be that the families receive the just compensation that, and insofar as money can ever be said to compensate somebody for the loss of a loved one, that they certainly get access to that, and access in a very timely fashion, not in a lengthy and protracted set of litigation.
We're talking in the millions here. Just to take the reality of what that is.
I mean, I tell people it's a formula. If you're working out a death claim, a wrongful death claim, it is the salary of the person immediately prior to their death, multiplied by the number of likely years that they would have worked in this environment. I mean, I take it that diving is a place that you don't retire at 65. I'm sure it's a younger person endeavor. But I mean, that's the formula. I mean, give or take a lot of permutations, but the core compensation arises out of the loss of the earning capacity of the deceased person, and therefore the loss of the contribution of the earning person to their family and the dependents, I should say also.
Yeah. You said the companies operated in silos rather than in tandem at the height of this tragedy, and they were caught flat-footed, as it were, and had to figure out a way to go forward.
I mean, that has so many aspects, so many prongs on that statement that I made in my closing. But it is clear, as I said, one entity had the expertise. I believe the two principals of the company were divers themselves. One was lost in the accident. So they had the expertise to plan a rescue plan. And they were doing their own thing on site. And Paria was off-site doing their own thing and calling out their own experts. And there was very little discussion. There was very little discussion. There was very little collaboration between the parties. I mean, therein is the tragedy. So here's somebody who has expertise in-house and has the ability to call out external expertise, which she did. And they're working in one silo on the site, and then we have Paria working in a silo in a building close by on the land. And seems to me that in between there was very little collaboration, and that collaboration would have been key in pulling off a successful rescue. But it didn't happen for many reasons. I mean, this show isn't long enough to say why, but for many reasons emerging from the evidence, it did not happen.
You want to take a stab at pointing out a couple at those reasons why it didn't happen?
As I said, I think there was again, Paria was clear, we don't have the expertise. But Paria distanced themselves from the expertise that they themselves chose to hire. So it seems counterintuitive to me to say, well, I don't have the expertise, I don't have diving expertise, I don't have diving experts available at my fingertips, I don't have remote operated vehicles to send down in the pipelines, I don't have that expertise. Here are the people with the real expertise, and I'm not really interested in hearing what they have to say in terms of a plan. When cross-examined about this plan that they were looking forward, because you're on the horns of a dilemma, we have 4 men still in the pipeline, 1 man emerging to say that they're all alive. You were hearing about, I want a method statement, I want a risk analysis. Well, I asked the question, if somebody falls into the water of the Paria, one of their installations, and is drowning, do I have to put together a risk analysis and a method statement in order to jump into the water to save that person or throw them a life ring or a life jacket or something? It was difficult to listen to some of the evidence that emerged in this case because lives were lost because people were not speaking to each other, people were not liaising with each other, people were not putting their heads together. They were working in opposite directions, yet the key target was the same. So it begs the question, so this is the expert that you chose, you put out a tender, this you say is the person that won the tender, this person was successful, this was the best tender offer that you received. Surely you must invest some confidence in their ability to pull off the job, and part of the job was diving. Therefore, if you have a diving accident, where should the expertise come from?
Yeah. So one wonders whether, to the extent that these are works that have to take place in the course of business that Paria does, what's the relationship going to be forward, if there's going to be any relationship between Paria and LMCS?
Well, I don't know. I mean, I have a feeling that relationship might be fractured. It had some vintage on it, but I feel it is fractured. I mean, Andy, the real truth was coming down to the very tail end of this inquiry. We had a lot of calls from people who were retirees from Petrotrin and Trinmar. And they gave us a lot of insight, which I wish they had given me at an earlier stage so we could have put to witnesses at the time. So there were lots of evidence, lots of people gave me information that, these jobs they're good. These jobs are not unusual. But they were done a different way in Petrotrin's time. And I must say, bearing in mind what I've been told, those methodologies were more expensive. Those methodologies involved pigging a line before you did work on it, and pigging meant cleaning it. You put something in that takes out the oil residue. And it also involves in flooding the line. So guess what? You pig your line, you clean it, so your hydrocarbon residues are reduced. You flood your line with commercial water or seawater for the industrial water or seawater as the case may be. And you will have no delta P. You would have complete no differential pressures between the seawater outside and the line on which the work is going to be done. So, as I said, there was a safe way, which apparently worked magnificently in the past, and there was a cheaper way that was employed in this job.
So, and there are people out there who know what should have been done because they've had experience in the past.
Oh, yes. And there are people in Paria who also know, because many of the people in Paria, they didn't come from, they didn't fall out of the heavens. They came from Petrotrin and Trinmar. Mr. Piper, I think Mr. Mohammed, the general manager, is a new employee, but Mr. Piper, Mr. Wee, Miss Balkisoon, all of these people were working in Petrotrin or Trinmar, as the case may be. So it was news to me as an external party, and as information given very late in the game, and then people would not come forward to give evidence of this fact. But if what they say is true, and from my investigations and inquiries, what they have said is true, then this job, there was a safer way to do this job.
Well, what do you think about it? What does it say about us that, well, not necessarily personally, but why people who would have expert information of what transpired, what didn't happen that should have happened, and what happened that should not have happened, why would people be reluctant to come forward and state what they think?
I mean, I have to say, people are built differently. Not everybody wants to come out and subject themselves to rigorous cross-examination. There were people, I mean, the entities that I represent didn't have any interest in, dismantling any witness, only to seek to elicit certain information. Some witnesses were brought to tears. Some witnesses had very emotional outbursts. I mean, how many people would want to subject themselves voluntarily to such an exercise? Maybe that was it. Maybe there are people who are hoping that they, get a contract from the new entities that replace Petrotrin and Trinmar. Who knows, as I said. But not everybody is going to come out and say, well, look, I'm willing to subject myself to rigorous cross-examination and the full glare of the public view. I gather it's somewhere in those factors is the reason that people did not come from.
Yeah, and when you make the point about how the relations between the two companies developed over the period of this in some unnecessary ways, do you think that that will add to the demands for what, I'm searching for a term here that you all use about what you call exemplary damages, with the bad handling of the incident ex post facto, will that play a role in determining?
I certainly see the steps taken in this matter would give rise to some form of punitive damages if it reaches that far. I mean, I'm still very hopeful that with the level, I mean, when we generally start a wrongful death claim or personal injury claim, we don't have access to this level of evidence that the parties who represent the families will have the benefit of from the Commission of Inquiry. So I'm hopeful that with the level of evidence that is out there and the conclusions that the commission eventually comes up with, that there would be some settlement of these families, because I know some people had ex-wives and current wives and so on. I hope that these families would receive compensation, and it is quite possible to propose some outside of litigation for some form, whether it's aggravative, whether it's punitive, whether it is exemplary. Certainly the suffering of the families, I mean, that really tore the heartstrings. It's one thing to hear that your relative or your loved one has died in an industrial accident of some form. It's another thing to be there for days, starved for information and clinging on to any hope. And then to discover that, they may have been alive maybe up as late as Saturday evening, possibly into Sunday, in relation to one of the died.
Yeah, this is a matter that is very much still alive. Attorney Nairi Alfonso, thank you very much for talking with us on this issue.
Thank you very much for having me, Andy. A pleasure.
You're very welcome. This has been 10 Questions. I'm Andy Johnson. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time.